What's up? How you doing? Thank you so much for being here. I really want to say that I don't take it for granted at all that y'all showed up, because showing up is huge, especially in this day and age of not showing up. It really matters that you're here, so thank you for being here. And let me tell you something else we all loved about Lasso. Sierra must have knocked out for a bit there. She wiped her eyes and looked up from her dad's shoulder just in time to see Juan stumble up the steps and pause on the maroon carpet beside the podium. Rose's speech came careening to a halt. Juan squinted at the chapel, broke into a perfect moonwalk, spun once, and then mamboed up to the microphone as gasps and mutters broke out across the room. Rosa stepped out of the way, her face bright red. Sierra sat up and rubbed her temples. "Look," Juan drawled, his voice blurting sloppily from the cheap PA system. "I'm gonna let you finish. Actually, psych, I'm not. You talked long enough for like an entire lifetime, Tia." Rosa stuttered. "Pero, nah." Juan shook his head a few too many times, then stared at the back of the room like he was trying to will it to slow down. He's wasted, brother. He was trying to will it to slow down. "Vete, it's my turn." Rosa frowned and stepped off the dais, grumbling to herself. "None of y'all really knew last." Sierra was about to open her eyes and run like hell when Izzy's voice filled the air. "A tyrant. Ultra-violent. Unstoppable. Undroppable. A monster. Thought you had it, now you lost her," Izzy spat. Her voice started shaky. She backstepped as she rapped, but it got stronger with each rhyme. "I'm a slammer, demon duchess, like MC Hammer. You can't touch this. I'll curse this, you luckless. #1 on the suck list." Sierra felt the tall spirit whose vision she had shared strengthen as each line dropped. Long, shadowy arms stretched out and darkened, solidifying the strength of Izzy's lyrical prowess.
Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. This is really amazing for me. Daniel is one of the first friends I made in the literary world, and really, when I was thinking, there's no way I can do this, I can't write, I can't blah, 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 and G-chatting Daniel being like, "Ashley, shut the fuck up. you got this."
I don't even swear.
Yeah. Yeah, have some water. So, obviously I love Shadowshaper. I obviously love Shadowhouse Fall, or I wouldn't have agreed to do this. And so, I had a few questions that I wanted to ask you, just based off of the book, the series that I love so much, and about you, because so much of I feel like you is in your books. Like there are some people who I read their books and I'm like, okay, they created something separate from who they are, and that's really notable and nice. But you are all over your books, even when you're writing about teen girls, which is really interesting. So let's just start here. What were some of your favorite reactions from the first book in the series? Because Shadowshaper, you were so excited about it coming out, I remember.
Yeah.
And we were both just really so excited for people to read it, but I don't think either of us anticipated, well, maybe you did, you seem to think very highly of yourself, but anticipated just how much people would love this book. Like I feel like even I was a little bit overwhelmed hearing the way people reacted to Shadowshaper, and I didn't have shit to do with it.
But the number one best thing that always really kind of gets me is that people will tell me that it feels like home. Mm-hmm. And it gets me because I know how deep it is to find home in a book when you haven't for your whole life. Mm-hmm. Because that's there's a cyclical power to that, because that's why I wrote the book. I was looking for myself in the pages, and it's ironic because I did end up writing a book about someone who's not me, but it came from that impulse of knowing that, of that sense of loss, of being like, there's a moment I think in every person of color's life, but everyone's life who's just not, a straight white dude, when you're like, where the fuck am I? And then you're like, wait, I feel like I should be here. And you're like, this is all trash because I'm not here. And you're like, well, some of it's alright. And then you're like, Game of Thrones is pretty cool. And then you're like, since I'm not here and I can't count on the world to show me the way that I really am, I have to then either write the shit or find a way to lift up the shit that other people are writing that's not getting played. Right. And so that's the fire that, not just impulse, that's the fire that made this book happen. this whole series, and really my career. Like I entered into writing to do that very clearly, and to do it while telling great stories, because they're not different, right? In fact, I think they make stories better when we're more honest about the world. So I think it's like when people recognize that and recognize themselves in the book and see that, like, you know, just those moments, and it's written for young people, but it's just as much people who aren't young, including old people, who have told me that, because literature has just been lying to us for decades and decades.
Right.
And they like, so the second most common comment, which I love and is also heartbreaking, is that, you know, I wish I had this when I was a kid. And I'm like, me too, that's why I wrote it. Like, really, that's very much what it is. And then the really sad one that I also get that doesn't make me happy, but I'm also like, well, I'm glad I talked about it, is that the most resonant scene in Shadowshaper is that moment when Tia Rosa is just purely trash, and then she gets shut down.
Yeah.
Because everyone has a Tia Rosa. And like, when I wrote it, I was very specifically thinking of how anti-black and fucked up we are in the Latino community. When she says, you know, don't date anyone darker than the bottom of your foot. Come to find out, which I guess I knew, but like, the degree of specificity that anti-blackness has on a global scale became so apparent to me when people from South Asia, you know, different parts of Africa, East Asia, all were coming to me and be like, I heard the exact same thing from my version of Tia Rosa. And just how fucked up that is, but also how glad I was that I put that in there. Because I think I could have just been like, we're all happy Latinos, you know. Yay, abuelo, mariposa, you know. And like, it's way complicated. And like, I think we have to recognize that as we simultaneously celebrate who we are. And that's sort of the great challenge of writing, particularly writing as people of color today.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I have my Tia Rosa. Tia Rosa was a really interesting character, and so many of the characters in the book are so, I feel like they all have a humanity. I don't read a lot of throwaway characters in your books. Everybody has a purpose. But I feel like probably one of the best characters and the most well-written character in your books are the city. I know people always talk about, like, in books or whatever, it's like, oh, and the city was another character. Everybody's like, I mean, I guess. You know, it was a setting. You named some streets, I guess. But I feel like, but when you write about Bed-Stuy, when you write about Prospect Park, and I'm somebody who's only lived in New York for 3 years, your books have almost introduced the city to me. There are these amazing places, and I feel like I get to see them through new eyes in your book. When you talk about specifically home, right? Because you're from Boston, and New York is your chosen home. Right. It's your adopted home. Why do you figure it so prominently into your books? Like, why is it so important for you to make it clear that, like, because what I feel like when I read this book is this could only happen where it's happening. Right. And it couldn't happen on the Upper West Side. You know what I mean? And
That's true.
And it couldn't happen on the Lower East Side. Right. Like, it has to happen in book.
At first, it was less of a choice than I think it appears to be on the page. It just seems like very natural and kind of correct to really bring the world around them to as full light as possible. Because I feel like as we experientially move through the world, you know, so much of what's happening to us, whether it's actually physically happening to us or just our, you know, perception of the world around us, is framed by the place that we are, whether it's the sights and the smells, you know, or the events or what have you, but also our memories. I feel like if we're being true to our characters, whoever they are, we're telling the story of how they're moving through the world, which means we're also telling the story of the world. The really key thing to me with setting is that it's dynamic. Like in school, they're always like, oh yeah, setting is place plus time or whatever. And it's such bullshit. Because like, setting is so much more than place plus time. And what does place plus time really mean? Absolutely nothing. Like, you know, look at one block in Bed-Stuy, and then, but they're like, yeah, New York City, 1950 means nothing. Like, you just said a vague word. So, you know, I believe, like, if we're being honest about the movement of people, the movement of place, that's when places come to life, is through people and through the stories that the street itself tells. So it's sort of the same answer to the, like, how do you write people who aren't you question? You fucking listen. But like for real listen, not like bullshit listen. You know, like what's really being said by the streets. Right. And how is it being filtered through my own perception based on privilege, based on where I'm from originally, based on being an outsider, and then try to really get deep about what that filter does and break through it to get to what it would mean to a character, whoever that may be.
And you talk about world building a lot in general. Like I've seen you present on world building. I've seen you do entire Twitter threads about world building.
No idea what you're talking about.
And it's but it's an important thing. It's something, it's a concept that really, to be perfectly honest, you sort of introduced to me, the idea of world building. But one of the things that I never considered really about world building until I read the Shadowshaper series is mythology building. Like you didn't just build a world like this, but when you talk about like the simplicity of setting, like this isn't just a setting.
Right.
You've like gone back and back and back and created a pure mythology. And I'm wondering, like, what does that feel like to create a mythology?
Some of that I think happens because in fantasy, like we're trained to care about world building, and I think when it comes to like the literary, non-secular type people, you know, they're like, oh yeah, just write some deep stuff about belly buttons or whatever. That's not what they do. I'm just saying, like, they don't focus on world. They act like world building is over here for the fantasy people, and it's no coincidence that, you know, at MFA programs all over the world, you see people just being like, don't talk to me about ghosts or goblins. That's for those people that make lots of money. Not for nothing, and, you know, and tell real stories. But I think like we all have to world build. Like, and the world building is strong in Shadowshaper. Most of it isn't fantasy stuff. Like that's additional add-on icing on the cake shit. But the real world building is about what we just talked about, telling the truth about the city. And then the second part, which I think you're really speaking to, is that it's about community. And that's a level that also in fantasy, we're only now that people of color are really starting to enter into fantasy in a real way, in a way that's like getting attention and blowing up, because we've always been there. Now we're starting to see books that are really in conversation with the idea of community instead of like the one douchebag to rule them all type thing. You know, the chosen one bullshit and all the other like really damaging ass myths that we tell ourselves about how this rugged individual rise up above all the other people. And not for nothing, that's the model we also see for what success looks like as a writer, is that you rise up in a singular fell swoop, you know, destroy all your enemies and get away from your community and put that one book out that's like jumps to the top of all the lists and gets you on Oprah and all that other bullshit. It's very unhealthy. But it wasn't like, "Papa!" Because that shit is dangerous to your psyche, to your mental health, to your humanity, because it's about separating you from your world. People start to trash us. It's our community that will help us. You know, not our fans, not our guest people, but the people who will tell us the truth about ourselves. So that's what I was really interested in doing, both with Shadowshaper and even deeper so with Shadowhouse Fall, is talking about the complexity of what it means to be a part of a community and not have that luxury, which is really a danger of kind of like breaking out of that and just being the one, you know, to rule them all.
Well, that's actually one of the things that I really loved about this book, and I told you this before, so I'm not, you know, I'm not dropping this on you. But I actually liked Shadowhouse Fall even more than I liked Shadowshaper.
So does my editor.
But you know, of the two books in the series, it's right now my favorite one. We'll see what you do in the future. But one of the things that I liked about it so much was the idea of community and collective impact versus the like Highlander individualistic myth, like versus that. And one of the things that I wondered, or like maybe I know, but you know, not everybody knows, how do you activate and support your community? Like, what does that look like in your life?
The first thing that comes to mind is teaching, but I think not in the strict way of like, yeah, I have students and I get a paycheck and I show up. No offense, y'all. That is one form of teaching and that is a form of community, you know, building. But more in the sense of like, how are we sharing ourselves with a larger community? Like right now, if we're being honest, like communities are happening online in a way that's very real and powerful. You know, like, and that matters. And that we're able to have conversations on a global level that we couldn't have before because of these platforms. But effectively, the literary community is very much happening in an online forum, which is dangerous and dope at the same time. But it's real. And so I feel like if I'm honest about every step of my process in terms of, you know, this is what I went through as a young writer trying to get to somewhere. This is what it felt like to fail and fail again. That's why I always shout out the 40 rejections that Shadowshaper got and the continued rejections that I still get as a successful writer. as a successful writer, with no quotation marks, killing the game, but I still get rejected, you know what I mean? And that's important to say because I feel like there are all these just really damaging false images, whether it is the one and only motif or just the idea that you're mating. And then that's a simple, straightforward thing that a door closes behind you and everything works out, you know? And that's not the case. So I feel like the first thing is really honesty about process, honesty about journeys and what that means, you know, to the extent that you're comfortable with it. And not personal like honesty, it's like, this is the real questions that I've had to ask myself about being a writer. So I have a platform and I use it to try to be as human as I can and not just have sunglasses on and do that.
There's an introduction of a new character in this book, a young man.
Yeah, they heard about
you guys heard about him a little bit, Anthony. And one of the things
she read the book, that's why.
She ready. One of the things that really, that I also really loved about this book and the introduction of the Anthony character is that he's a young man. A young man of color who allows himself to be vulnerable with Sierra in a really specific way about mental health and about mental health issues. And that really struck me because as someone who deals with the same mental health issue and also someone who just doesn't see that happening with young men very much, I wondered, like, was that intentional to have this young man be in such a vulnerable place that doesn't have anything to do with his physical strength and has everything to do with, you know, another kind of vulnerability? Yeah, absolutely, very much so. I mean, you know, it's always a question of like, I feel like anytime we write characters that have been so viciously stereotyped, especially black boys and girls, particularly, there's just these really evil, rigid boxes lined with teeth and barbed wire and everything else that tell us about what that blackness means. And people of color in general, but I think very specifically, we all know like what, you know, those damaging images have been for so long. So when you're up against that, I feel like there's this double-edged sword to how you represent a character who has that history on the page, because you can't just flip the script. You know, because then you're still reacting to this negative shit and you're still letting that determine how you write and who you write and what that character is, and you still get a robot, even if it's a perfect robot. You know, like we don't need perfect characters, we need human characters. And that's hard. So it took having a multiplicity of different characters, but specifically with Anthony, it was about him he's, you know, outwardly sort of perfect in a lot of ways. There's a lot about him that's just shining and bright. And he's talented and good looking and all this other stuff. And I don't really believe in like the flaw method of character creation. I think that does it a little bit of an injustice to kind of the depth of who we are. Because if you think about it, like real people, you're not like, you know, Ashley's great, but she has that one flaw. What is it? Oh, you know, she just, whatever. Usually it's like some bullshit, like she's just too giving. You know, it's like when you're at that's not true. It's like when you're at a job interview and they're like, well, what's the one thing you need to work on? You're like, I just work so hard. It's terrible. God, I hope one day I learn to work less hard. You know, it's bullshit. But even when it's not that, even when it's an actual factual flaw, it just feels fake. Like you could just check it off the list. Like, oh, this is Sierra's flaw. She's whatever. I just think we're more complex than that. And so with Anthony, it was less about, hey, it's less. If you walk across the stage, he's going to call
get called out. You know, that's how it works. It's less about like this is one thing that's gonna whatever, and it's more about like what's gonna be a full human. You know, as much as we can talk about this, and then what's gonna bring them together in a way that's real and also very fragile.
Right. And so it creates a little bit of a love triangle. A little bit. Just a touch. Just a touch of a love triangle. A touch of a love triangle. Basically, like Sierra's attentions are split a little bit, a touch. But the confluence of art and magic And it made me wonder or have a question for the esteemed author, which would be, do you think love is more like art or magic?
Oh my God. God damn.
Look at, now he's distracted.
I know. I'm trying to get away from the question. Is love more like magic or art? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Speaking of love triangles? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's kind of like, I guess I'll use the metaphor of spirituality. As a spiritual person, it's easy to mistake that spirit is over here, and then there's career, and then there's relationships, and then there's family, as these kind of like separate boxes that we make for ourselves, when really like spirit is water. And it goes through everything that we are and that we have and that we do. And you can't just be like, well, my spiritual life is over here, I'm gonna go. You know what I mean? And love is also like water. And magic, I think, is a little bit of everything too. So I don't have such a differentiation between those sort of three things that I could just say this, that, and the other. Art is a medium through which we kind of take in the world and spit it back out. And we have to do it with some sense of love. Otherwise, we'll write really bitter shit, and no one wants to read that. Some people do. And magic is a part of that art, you know. So I write about magic, and the writing process itself is a form of magic because it, on one level, makes dreams come true. In a very real, like we're sitting here, this is a dream coming true that I wrote into existence by writing the story of this girl. And on another level, it's a small kind of magic that allows me to take in this broken world and spit it back out as something whole that I can understand, instead of just these constant barrages of, you know, bad news every time I turn on the motherfucking news every day, which is not good, right? So that's the function of art in a very real way. That's both personal and hugely political. That's both spiritual and a question of love. And you know, I feel like I just read it. Hopefully move on to the next question.
I'll take it. But a lot of people bring up the social and political bent of the book, because those things are not just intricately, but like prominently placed in the book. Like we just heard about, you know, the spirits who show up who have all been killed by police officers. And you hear right now that like people are like, no, it's like people really want escapism. They don't want to think about these things. They just want to get away from it. And I feel like you putting those things in this book, are you sort of saying like, fuck that, no, this is exactly what we should be talking about right now, and particularly with young people. So I was wondering, because I know you have a lot more interactions with young people than I do at this point in my life. I'm surrounded by boring adults all day.
That sucks.
All day, yeah. I miss babies, it's been a long time. But do you think we're talking to and with young people enough about these issues? Because I know that they are having their own conversations between each other. But are we having those intergenerational conversations with the kind of teens who would be, you know, in this place?
I know I am, and I think most of the people that I care about or the people who are doing dope work are. And I think that young adult literature and middle grade literature as a whole is now this year really stepping up and has sort of slowly stepped up to the plate in a way that's really big, because now it's, you know, there's multiple books coming out and that have come out about this question, very specifically about state violence. And what I love is that they show a lot of different places on the spectrum of what it means to deal with that on an emotional level for a young person. And that's dope. We really lack that. Why it was caught way off guard, let's just say, when this whole thing blew up and Black Lives Matter took to the streets to say this wasn't okay. Mind you, none of it was new, right? Like the movement was new. The movement was newly gigantic, but the movement had always been there. And the police killings have always been there. So you can't just say like, oh, this is a new phenomenon and it takes a while to put a book out. And not for nothing, music was on the game. Like the second that, you know, protesters started hitting the streets, we had anthems to join us along the way, whether it was D'Angelo or, you know, what have you. People were putting out albums within a couple weeks of the huge protest breaking out. So where were we? And so, you know, it's been sort of starting to come up, and now it's really coming up, and there's a slew of them this year, which is great. But mainly, I guess, like what I really want to do specifically with this one was have kids involved in it who didn't need a wake-up call, but were already very, very radical.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to read that, partially because that's the kids that I know.
Right.
Like the kids that I know and interact with are already fed the fuck up because, on some level we dropped the ball. And they, came into this mess that we kind of left them ready. And I needed kids on the page to be like that, not to have to get there. I love that there's also stories about kids that have to get there, because there's those kids too. I just wanted this story to be about kids who are already really radical and ready to move and take action from page one. So that was a big part of my own thinking, because again, that's the kids I know.
I saw not too long ago that the rights were sold.
Yes.
So what are we thinking about? In the movie and TV
also not allowed to talk about it, but I will say that it's not sitting on a shelf somewhere. There's movement, and it's awesome movement, and there's good things afoot, and it's in good hands. Anika Noe Rose. By the way, Anika did the narration on the audiobook of Shadowshaper, and she came back to do it again for Shadowhouse Fall, and she killed it. And she's such a pro. She's such a pro. It's another book in her hands, 10 times better. And I'm like, I thought I wrote the shit out of that book, but it turns out that I could have written it better because she made it sound even better than it really is. It's like, if you listen to audiobooks, this is one to really listen to because she's amazing. But all that to say, it's in really good hands. And that was the most important thing for me. It could have already been done, made, but people wanted to make it and weren't going to make it right. By which I mean they were going to whitewash it. And that was where I put my foot down. I think people don't understand that as an author, you're not a casting director. As soon as you sign the papers, your power is over. And I knew that. And so the time that you do have control is before you sign the papers and who you give it up to. So if people basically weren't going to commit to not whitewashing it, they weren't going to make it. That's how it has to be. What do I look like having a whitewashed version of Shadowshaper out in the world?
Yeah.
I'm out that I am. You know what I mean? How the fuck would I look? But also just, how dare we do that?
Yeah.
How dare we do that to this story, which is so specifically about what it's about, which is an Afro-Latina girl being proud and finding that truth inside of herself through magic.
Right.
You're not gonna paint a pretty blah, 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 fake, whatever nonsense on that and try to make it into a story about a white girl or even a white passing girl.
Right.
Because that's not what it is. I put my foot down, and that's part of why it's not made yet. And that's awesome, as far as I'm concerned, because it shouldn't be done at all.
Yeah, I agree.